I've been doing a lot of thinking lately. Over the past few years, my mind has been poring over some way to take a complex story and reduce it down to simpler parts to better understand what makes great stories so great. How do we take a beautiful story like Lord of the Rings and pick it apart to understand what makes it so unique? How do we learn what makes a story like this so endearing to so many people? In the analysis of so many different stories, breaking them down by pacing and dialogue and prose and setting and characters and tension and conflict and plots and so many more things, I think I've finally done it. I figured out the three main components to great stories. I figured out the storytelling triangle. And more importantly, I figured out how to make sure that your story lands among the greats. Let's start by understanding why I've chosen the three main components of the storytelling triangle. There are so many elements that go into creating a good story. How can you distill these parts of writing into just three areas? Well, when you think of a good book, there are likely a couple of things that immediately come to mind about why you like that book so much. Now, the first thing I want to do is I want to start by saying what's not in the storytelling triangle. You do not have to be a great writer to tell a great story. You don't have to be George R.R. Martin or Stephen King or John Steinbeck to make a great story. Now, all of those authors have great writing skill and they can of course create great stories, but writing skill alone does not make a story work. These components that make up a story are within the story itself. So let's start with characters. Our story requires a character or characters that the reader can relate to. That relation between reader and character is so incredibly important because it's through those characters' eyes that the reader experiences the world. Even in a story that isn't told in the first person, the main character's words and actions are what drive the reading experience. And because this category of the triangle includes things like the character's actions and words, of course the way that the author writes that character is a large part of how that reader experiences the character. And what I mean by that is that the character element in the storytelling triangle is judged by how those characters perform within the story and how the author presents them. And this extends beyond the protagonist and into every character featured in the story. If you write a fantastic main character, but the antagonist completely lacks depth, development, or motivation, then your story suffers because of it, regardless of how much effort you put into that main character. The second component of the triangle is the setting. The setting here describes all of the world building that story takes place in. It's the cities that the characters visit and the cultures they interact with. It's the weather and the history that all of these things, all these characters reside in. If the characters are the paint of the story, then the setting is the canvas that paint sticks to. And this includes physical places, but also the atmosphere of the story. A great example of an interesting atmosphere for story is Under the Dome by Stephen King. The story takes place in a small town, and that in itself is not very interesting, but the fact that the town is then sectioned off from the rest of the world by this huge force field, I guess, changes everything. The town, still the same, but now there's this stifling atmosphere that makes the reader feel like they're just as trapped as the characters. The simple fact of isolating that small town immediately changes the setting. The final component of the triangle is plot. And in the case here, plot refers to the events of the story. In the case of plot, there are two kinds of plots that we want to be aware of. The first kind is called passive plot. These are events that happen in the world that our prospective characters cannot control. The fact that a volcano erupts and puts our characters into danger is something that they don't have control of. There was nothing that our characters did to move the plot in that direction. Our characters, and therefore our reader, are passive in relation to that plot movement.
Don't look back.
The second kind of plot is active plot. This is when we have characters perform some sort of action that pushes the plot forward.
You can shoot it single action. That's like trigger pull.
Did you mean to do that?
Yeah.
In many cases, this is a more satisfying reading experience because our characters have some sort of agency in the story. And of course, most stories will have combinations of these types of plot points. When placing stories in the storytelling triangle, we judge each element of a story and we plot it there. Doing this can help us understand a couple different things, and let's start with stories that fall just short of being great. I recently read Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry, and so many people praised this book for its rich characters. And truly, they're full of depth and realism, and they each act uniquely based on their motivations and on their personalities, and that's really hard to do as an author. These characters are incredibly well done. But the other two elements here, plot and setting, don't seem to be given as much attention. The setting is, most of the times, just the plains of America, wide open expanses of nothingness that the characters are driving cattle through. And there's a couple of small towns that the characters visit, but 90% of this book is just out amongst these plains. The plot is meandering and lacking structure. There are moments of excitement and danger, but they're extremely passive moments of danger that the author seems to throw in during dull stretches just to try to keep the reader interested. In one instance, a character is bitten and killed by a snake while crossing a river. In another instance, a character is struck by lightning during a storm. In another instance, a character is thrown from a horse and breaks his arm. These moments could happen in any order, at any time, and the reading experience would not be impacted at all. They're examples of passive plot that really lacks investment. This book is extremely character-rich, but not rich in setting or plot. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the character-driven zone. This is an area of the triangle that marks stories that suffer because of a large focus on characters and a lack of focus on plot or setting. Each section of the triangle has these wastelands, homes for stories that do one thing really well. Character-driven stories, setting-driven stories, and plot-driven stories. Now, setting-driven and plot-driven stories suffer the same issues. There are plenty of horror novels that craft an incredible setting, but fall short in other areas. Setting-driven stories can be found in horror, but also science fiction, where the world around the characters may have been the driving idea for the author. Plot-driven stories can be exciting and fun and thrilling, but lack characters with depth or an interesting world. These books can feel like an action movie when you read them. In fact, I call this entire side of the triangle the Michael Crichton area. His novels are largely ones of great plot, of interesting technology within the setting, but his stories don't often have memorable characters. And that's okay. You don't read Crichton for astounding character work, but for interesting ideas and action movie plot pacing. You definitely don't read his books for interesting female characters, I'll say that much. Now, finding your novel within these wastelands is not a bad thing. Readers may be looking for books that have a focus on setting or on world building, or they may look for books that have that action movie style pacing. But if you find that your novel's there by accident, then it can serve as a sign for what kind of work you need to do to nudge your novel out of the wastelands and into the heart of storytelling. This is where those all-time great novels live. It's the area for novels that are able to balance strong characters, an interesting setting, and an exciting plot. You'll notice that this area, the heart of storytelling, is not perfectly balanced. There's still leeway to be found as stories lean towards one of those three elements in the triangle. Any story that falls in this heart of storytelling has enough focus in all three components of the triangle to be a balanced and rewarding reading experience. This is where you would find Lord of the Rings, a story where the focus is really on the setting and the plot, but the characters have received attention by the author as well. Now, many of these characters here are not all-time great fantasy characters, not really, but definitely compared to how influential like the setting and the plot were within Lord of the Rings, they're not as impactful. But they all have distinct motivations, they all have personalities, they all react appropriately to the world around them. This is where you could find other books like Ender's Game by Orson Scott Card, or Pet Sematary by Stephen King, or The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Side note, look how horrendous this cover is for Pet Sematary. This is insane to me. This is insane. Let me compose myself. Now, is this a long-winded video to tell you that your novel should be balanced? Partly, yeah. But it's also a long-winded way to tell you that great stories are balanced, but good stories don't need to be. One of my favorite books of all time is East of Eden by John Steinbeck, and it's a very character-driven story, and it doesn't have super interesting settings. In fact, I think it lives within here at the Triangle, and I loved it. It's not a perfectly balanced book, but I still think it's a fantastic book. That being said, you know I don't feel the same way about Lonesome Dove, which is a similar character-driven book. Michael Crichton is a great author, and his books are incredibly fun to read. I loved Congo and I loved Pirate Latitudes, both of which are not balanced books within the Triangle, but I recommend them to people who are looking for an exciting and fun read. Analyzing a story and enjoying a story are two different things with two different purposes. I want to analyze stories because I want to understand how I can make my own stories better. I want my story to end up within that heart of storytelling. Looking critically at my own work and plotting it realistically on this triangle helps me understand where my shortcomings are. I feel like I do pretty well with settings and characters, but I know I need to make more effort in creating a plot that's more structured, that's based on more active plot points if I want to balance my novel. Judging books based on graphs like this is something that I enjoy doing, and it's the same with critiquing stories and trying to learn what I can from accomplished authors. If you learn the same way that I do, and you want to join on these explorations into storytelling, like and subscribe. Check out my website at www.writingtheory.com for more in-depth content like this. And lastly, thank you for watching.